So, good evening again, everybody. Today we are taking up the fourth of our 6 points of practice. And so today we're looking at Dharma study as a support for practice or support for zazen. So by now I'm sure you've heard more than once that we don't sit zazen in order to understand teachings, right? That it's actually the other way around. We study the Dharma with body and mind in order to understand zazen, which seems a bit counterintuitive, right? It seems like if we sit a lot of zazen, suddenly the magical world of Dogen will open for us and we'll understand everything he says. So what that means overall is that approaching Soto Zen as an intellectual exercise by maybe only reading books or engaging in the odd discussion or debate or something without doing zazen is fairly meaningless, right? The big part of the practice is missing if we're simply reading the books and doing a lot of debate and parroting what people are writing or saying, right? A big part of our understanding is missing because we're not actually studying with body and mind. It becomes an intellectual exercise. So from the very beginning of Sanshin, of course, Toto-san has been worried about our tendency to intellectualize things, intellectualize our practice. Zazen seems like a very simple practice, but as soon as we sit down and face the wall, immediately we start telling ourselves a lot of stories. We have a lot of ideas about what this zazen thing is, about what we're doing, about what it's for, right? What it means. We may be particularly interested in having some kind of peak experience. We may think the clouds are going to open and lightning's going to strike us and suddenly it's all going to become clear. Maybe we're doing our zazen in order to solve the problems of this karmic self. I'd like to stop procrastinating. I'd like to have better relationships. I'd like to have less suffering. I want to cure my sadness, whatever's going on, right? We want to use it for something. So this is why we need advice. This is why we need direction, pointers, guidelines from our teachers and ancestors and people who've done this before us, big brothers and sisters in the practice. This is why we need this. They can't do our practice for us. They're not going to come down from the mountain and hand us our practice. They can't do that, but we really, because we really need to take responsibility for ourselves, right? This is the non-reliance piece of our practice. We can only do our own practice. We can only walk forward on our own legs. But our teachers and ancestors can point us towards some important understandings that we may miss, or it might take us a long time to get to, or we may just never sort of be aware of these things in zazen. So we do so much zazen here. It is just so central to what we do, whether that's morning practice, 2 periods every morning, 5 days a week. That's the zazen on Sunday. It's the zazen we do before a discussion like this or a book discussion on Wednesday, not to mention all the many, many, many hours of sesshin. So we do a lot of zazen here, right? It's kind of dangerous to do that much zazen without really clearly understanding what it is we're doing. So it's the same reason that we need to deeply understand sesshin. Deeply understanding zazen and deeply understanding sesshin, I think, are kind of related, right? Because these things are so central, we really need to know what that's about. So we sit about 10 hours a week in an average week here, right? We're on the cushion about 10 hours a week on an average week. It's about 47 hours during a 5-day sesshin. That's a lot of zazen, right? So that's about 11 and a half hours a day in zazen, in sesshin, as compared to sort of a more average North American Dharma Center sesshin, which might be 6 or 7 hours a day. That's not better or worse. It's just clearly a very particular approach to sesshin, right? So if you're going to do something that intensively with the wrong attitude or with the wrong approach or the wrong understanding, clearly things are going to go off the rails pretty quickly. So this is why Toto-san started offering Genzo-e, right? The whole point of Genzo-e was to study a text in order to understand all of this zazen we were doing. Because at that time, he was doing even more sesshin than we're doing now. He was doing sesshin 10 times a year. Well, 6 or 7 times a year, right? So this is why Toto-san starts helping us to really investigate what Dogen is saying. But Dogen is teaching about zazen, so there's not much point in understanding Dogen's teachings if you're not also sitting, right? If you're not also doing this practice. If you're not interested in sitting, you're probably not that interested in Dogen. And yet, it seems like, oh, we should do a lot of Dogen study, and oh, by the way, there's that Teski zazen, right? These things are interconnected, right? So Toto-san used to say it's like reading a cookbook and never cooking a meal. If you're reading all that Dogen, you're trying to understand all that Dogen, and then you're not actually sitting zazen, and you're not connecting those two things in your practice. He says it's like, you know, reading the cookbook, but never actually making the food and eating the meal. So Dogen study done with the intellect, which we kind of do, right, is the complement, I think, to zazen and to work, because those two things are study with the body. Zazen and work are how we study with the body. And, you know, Dharma study, we could say, is how we study with the mind. So these things are complementary, right? We'll talk about work practice in our next discussion. And by the way, before the end, I need to just remind people we've actually changed the date. We've just changed the date of that. So next discussion, we're going to talk about work practice, which is all about practice with the body and study with the body. And also is not what we think it is. Not what we think it is, right? So what exactly are we studying? When we're talking about Dharma study, what exactly are we studying? And how are we going about that? So we're studying the teachings of Buddha and Dogen and our 20th century ancestors mainly. That's not to say we will never study a Chinese ancestor or never study some other Indian ancestor or never study another contemporary teacher. But when you look at what Todo-san tends to focus on, Buddha, Dogen, Sawaki Roshi, Uchiyama Roshi, and we also, you know, of course, read his writings and his teachings. So we do that so we can recognize and let go of the blocks, the hindrances that prevent us from really seeing reality clearly. So this is really the point of our study. What are we doing? We're trying to see through, dissolve, let go of the hindrances, right? The things that are getting in the way of seeing very clearly how the universe works, what the nature of the self is, where suffering comes from, what we do about all those things. Beginning with something as simple as the 3 marks of existence, right? Impermanence and suffering and no self. If we don't start there, it's difficult to go on. So we need to do that kind of discernment, because if we can't or don't do that kind of discernment, it is almost impossible to carry out our bodhisattva vows. We don't understand them. We don't know what it is. You know, bodhisattva is about liberating beings. Well, if we don't understand basics, how can we transmit those to others? And this is not just Dharma teachers, right? This is any of us who are practicing as bodhisattvas. We're moving through the world, liberating beings. How are we going to do that if we don't really clearly understand? So until someone points out things we haven't noticed, we miss them completely. I'm sure we've all had an experience in the Zendo of looking around going, oh, wait a minute. You know, everyone's doing this or that, and I'm not. Or, oh, this thing that I've heard, this happens all the time, right? This thing that I've heard for years and years, it's like suddenly someone phrases it differently. We go, oh, I see that differently now. Oh, that's connected to this. I can't tell you how many times that happens, right? Someone gave us a pointer. Someone gave us a push, right? Oh, I see this thing differently now. When you're just learning about something, you can miss the subtleties, right, that an experienced person will see. And that's not just zazen practice. That's, you know, water skiing or anything, right? If you're an experienced person, you see things because you've been in that world for a while. And an inexperienced person won't see those things. They're very clear to you. You know, oh, I never noticed that. I was so caught up in just the mechanics of what I was doing or just trying to sort of follow along, right? Somebody points out something. Oh. Now, you've probably encountered the argument that Zen, or the Dharma, is beyond words and letters, and therefore study is not necessary or contraindicated or useless. You might actually be wondering why one of our 6 points is even about Dharma study. You know, if that's the point of view that you take, it's like, well, why are we even talking about this? You know, why are our 20th century ancestors writing so many books, giving so many talks? Why are there so many words from all these people, right? If Dharma study is useless because the Dharma is beyond words and letters. So is the Dharma beyond words and letters? Absolutely. Do we usually understand what that means and live from that place? No, we don't, right? So, you know, we need to use words to go beyond words is one way to think about this. Dogen certainly, at the same time that he's saying all the words are dualistic, we can't cling to them, he's also saying those words also 100% express the Dharma in this moment. So we need to understand it both ways. So to read writing by somebody who's a little bit farther along this path, who could serve as a sort of a big sister or a big brother, you know, we get the chance to get into their heads and feel their experience and understand their perspective. How do they see the Dharma? How do they see the universe functioning, right? That can be really an eye-opener. Oh, look how they see the world. Oh, look how they perceive this thing, right? That's really different from the way I see it. And, because you don't know what you don't know. Somebody opens up kind of a whole new vista for you. Oh, I never saw it that way. So that can be helpful. So now, when we have that experience, now we're asking a whole new set of questions, right? Oh, there was this whole thing. I was never aware. Now I need to know about that. I need to practice with that. I need to investigate that, right? Because I've been pushed out of my complacency. I've been pushed out of my assumptions. Oh, there's something new here now that I need to understand. Thought I knew it all. Thought I got to the end of that thing. No, wait a minute. There's another hole, right? So we need to learn the basic elements of our tradition. We need to learn Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, Three Treasures, all that basic stuff as a basis for the further discussion and further study that we need to do, and also just for the basis of our lives. If we don't understand how those things work in our lives, it's very difficult to move forward as a bodhisattva. So those things really have to become a part of our worldview, right? A part of just sort of our automatic functioning. So in the case of Zen, we also need to be familiar with, I would suggest, some of the more important sutras in our tradition, Prajnapadamita literature. We do the Heart Sutra every morning. Lankavatara Sutra, Vimalakirti Sutra, Avatamsaka, Lotus Sutra, because, of course, Lotus Sutra was really big for Dogen. So to have some basic familiarity with those sutras is very helpful. Things get referred, things get quoted. It's very hard to understand Dogen if we don't understand the Lotus Sutra in some ways. Are we going to read them and memorize them? No. Some of them are huge. It's not necessarily easy reading, but some familiarity is helpful. And of course, being familiar, in our case, with the basics of Dogen's teaching is very, very helpful. So if you go look at my Introduction to Dogen series, which is now on YouTube, which is a workshop I gave several years ago, one part of that is I isolated 10 Dogen themes, not 10 Dogen texts, 10 Dogen themes that appear across his teaching. If we understand those things and then we read some piece of his that we've never read, we go, oh, there's that thing again. Oh, he's talking about this thing. Oh, there's that theme again, right? Suddenly the whole thing ties together, and it's not a set of random texts that seem kind of opaque, right? Oh, that's one of Dogen's favorite themes. Here it is again. So I suggest becoming familiar with those things. So some things we can keep in mind when we're undertaking Dogen study, and I'm speaking specifically about Dogen here because I think many of us are familiar with how to do a close reading, right? We've all been to school. How do you study something carefully? But there's some particular things about Dogen that can hang us up as Westerners. So these are some of the places I see people getting stuck. So Toda-san frequently recommends when we're reading Dogen, but I would say maybe other texts in translation too, that we look at more than one translation. So I know for myself, I tend, if Toda-san has translated it, that's my go-to, I look at what he translated. But he's often said, we need to look at more than one translation of something. Any translator is going to interpret. Right? Any translator has to choose particular words based on their understanding, to the best of their ability. So you have to make choices, you have to make interpretations. How much do you explain in the footnotes, right? So translators also have various skill levels, various experience levels, various specialties. Some of them are clergy, some of them are academics. They're coming at these texts from a different point of view. So to put these things side by side can be extremely helpful. There may be one section that particularly speaks to you, or you may realize there's a particular translator who translates in a way that makes sense to you, and it's good to know that. It might not be Toda-san, right? But it's good to know that, right? So we need to get this kind of well-rounded picture of something, especially something as non-linear as Dogen. There's more than one way to take what he says. You could probably, write a book about one or two lines because there's so many layers and so many ways to interpret that thing. So it's good to have more than one point of view. Even if it's just to point us toward, I want to investigate that more fully, right? We also need context for Dogen. He is so he's so set in context that not to have that is really sort of asking to misinterpret. We're never going to understand what he's doing. So the point of a lot of it is that he's turning conventional teaching of the time on its head. If we don't know what he's turning on its head, we don't understand what the point is that he's making. We don't understand what he's trying to break us out of, right? He's often writing in response to something. So I think we sometimes have a picture of Dogen up in his garret, sort of pumping out words of wisdom, unrelated to anything, but so much of his writing is in response to the way somebody else is practicing, something he sees going on in society, an understanding that's shifted over time, right? If we don't have that context, we don't know what he's responding to, it's really easy to misinterpret. He's not just sort of offering up a universal teaching, and for us, working in translation across time in another culture, we're kind of looking for the universality of what he's saying, and it's not that that's not there. But if we don't understand his context, we can centralize things he never meant to centralize. For instance, he will say something and we might say, oh, he feels really strongly about this, but actually he's refuting something, right? In his daily life, that might not have been a big deal, but somehow he's responding to something. So we need to know that stuff. It might just have been an argument in the text or a sideswipe. Sometimes he gets cranky, right? If you read Dogen, like sometimes he's a cranky guy. And you go, what's going on? He's responding to something. Like, we need to know that. Okay. So if we're reading along, so this is why we can't always just take the phrase or the sentence at face value, right? So, and it's why we need to know something about Japanese history and about Kamakura Buddhism, because this is his world. This is the world in which he's functioning, and why I spent so much time in the intro Dogen. I did whole lectures on Japanese history. Because if we don't understand that, we don't know what he's responding to. So it's not going to occur to us to look for the larger context, to look for the larger picture. Even when he's simply writing what looks like a list of instructions, we can distort that if we don't know, like, what was he trying to get people out of and into? So if we're reading along and we encounter something we don't understand, our tendency is to try to translate that into something we do understand. Oh, this must be like that thing that I already know about. Oh, this must be connected to this or this thing over here. We need to avoid trying to make it understandable from a 20th century, 21st century American point of view. Because we really want to have everything fit into neat little boxes, right? Oh, now I understand it. Now I've made sense of it. I've translated it into something I know. He's often trying to get us to question or let go of what we already understand. So we're actually not practicing with him in the way that he would want us to if we're simply translating it into something that we already know. This is, if we're confused, that's a signal to go, okay, wait a minute. What are my underlying assumptions here? Why do I believe what I believe? Is he trying to get me to look at this in a new way? We're usually pretty uncomfortable if we're not on top of stuff, right? If we're reading something, hearing something, and we don't get it, it's like, oh, that's, dissonance. That doesn't feel good to me. That feels like a blow to my ego. So I want to make sense out of it, and I'm going to do that any way I can, which means maybe I'm going to leave out that part, or maybe I'm going to use a different word, or, I'm going to fit it into something I know. We really want to connect the dots so we know how to go forward with this thing. But often his point is to unsettle us. Often his point is to make us uncomfortable. Right? So this is not a failure of our intellectual understanding. This is he's being successful and going, wait a minute, really? You think this and that, you believe this and that, but like, really? Isn't there another way to look at that? So we have to investigate and find out, like, what does he really mean, and not just stop at what we think he means or what makes us comfortable, right, about what we think he means. So where he seems to be negating something, this or that, doesn't exist or isn't important, he may actually be saying, this thing, it's not that this thing doesn't exist, it's not that thing isn't important, it's just that this is not the whole story. Like, there's a very famous quote that he says, from the time you start practicing with a teacher, all these other practices like bowing and chanting and nibbutsu and incense offering are not at all essential. I can't tell you how many North Americans interpret that to mean, don't do those things, only sit. We should never do liturgy, we should never bow, we should never study, we should never do anything, we should only do zazen because that's what Dogen's saying here. That's not what he's saying. He's saying do all those things, but don't fail to sit. Right? So we have to be a little bit careful how we read him. So, often he's saying things like, there is no delusion, there is no awakening, there's no life and death. He doesn't mean those things aren't real. Right? He's not negating life and death. He's not saying beings don't get born and die. He's saying that's not the whole story, right? What else is going on there? So he's probably saying if we see it in only one way, we've missed the mark, right? We've missed the mark. So also, just because Dogen is silent about something doesn't mean he doesn't think it's important, right? We also have to know, who is he talking to? He's usually talking to his monks. These are experienced practitioners. So he can take for granted that they know some things. So just because he doesn't talk about something doesn't mean, we can ignore that, or that's not important, right? Okay. I'm going to skip ahead through here because I have lots of pitfalls, but we don't have time to go into all of them. So let me just say, let's be careful about assumptions, reading modern American assumptions into his work. And I think there's a set of questions that we can ask ourselves when we sit down to do Dharma study. So again, I'm talking about Dogen, but it could be really anything. What are the circumstances of that teaching, right? Who is that teacher talking to? What's the circumstance of those teachings? Where are they being given? Who are the listeners? What do they already know? Also, what might this author be responding to in his own environment? What's the context for what he's doing? What do his students kind of need from him in that moment? Is he trying to head off a particular delusion that he sees in them, right? What are the important elements of that passage that we need to consider? What are the important points? Where is the theme coming up again and again? What are the important words in that text? When any author is citing other writers, other stories, other texts, what's he doing there? Do we need to go read the original? Maybe he's quoting from a sutra. Do we need to go look at the sutra? Do we need to find that folkloric story? Like, what are the references that are being made? Why is he bringing that in? Like, why is that important? For Dogen, he's often bringing in a text and then turning that on its head. So we have to be careful of, when he's working with koans, he's taking a non-traditional approach. Particularly for Dogen, for others too, we have to look at what literary devices is he using. I spent a lot of time on this in the intro Dogen as well, because the actual literary devices he used are adding meaning. So the way he chooses to phrase something, sort of the turns of phrase, the parts of speech, where something is in a text, the literary devices themselves are important. And I think the most important question is, how does what he's saying relate to my own personal concrete practice in this moment, right? He is talking about practice. He's not talking about how many bodhisattvas dance on the head of a pin, or if he is, he's doing that so that we bring it into our own practice. So the bottom line for any kind of Dharma study, but Dogen, because we can forget, is that it's not an exercise in literary analysis. It's an exercise in discerning what is he saying about practice, and what does that mean for me right now?